excited to talk with you today about cyber risk quantification and applying that in the operational technology environment, using the FAIR framework or methodology specifically. And if you're not familiar with it, it was sort of authored by someone by the name of Jack Jones, who at the time was a CISO at a large insurance company, and upon submitting requests for funding and budgeting for the next year, was asked a very interesting question by leadership. And that question was, well, how much risk do we have now in our environment? And if we give you everything you're asking for, right, we allocate this funding, we fix things, then how much risk do we have after that? And like many of you, right, when I first kind of heard that anecdote, I started to think, that's maybe a difficult thing to calculate, right? And you may be sitting here today thinking, yeah, if I was asked that question, that may be something that we don't have a great handle on today in our organization. And so that was really the genesis of FAIR, factor analysis and information risk. And so what we want to talk about today is not to suggest that this is the way to assess and manage risk in your environment and understand impacts. But I think it is a way, right, to consider. And as we think about the threat landscape, those of you that are part of publicly traded organizations, right, with the SEC cyber disclosure being sort of at the forefront, understanding how risk sort of exceeds, right, or meets your materiality threshold, and being able to measure that is maybe not an easy thing to do. And so being able to leverage something like the FAIR framework or methodology may be something that interests you, and it may be something that you look to employ in your own organizations. We could spend a lot of time on this. This is really meant today to be a bit of a precursor or introduction to where this can go. And so looking forward to the conversation today and diving in. So to give an overview, again, I will reiterate, you may be familiar with this classic formula for risk, right? Being impact times likelihood. And we're not saying that this has to go away or that this is antiquated, but if we take a risk like we don't have good visibility, we have a lack of visibility into our OT assets. We don't have good OT asset management, right? That is a risk, but how do we really quantify the likelihood of that risk or the impact of that? And how do we translate that into dollars? That might be difficult to do given the nature of that risk. So when we get into cyber risk quantification, what we suggest here is that we map out the event scenarios, right, or mapping out a threat chain. And this is to say, well, we have threats, a combination of a threat actor acting and using some method, like an exploit, to impact one or more assets. And we'll talk a little bit later about how you can define assets because there's some flexibility around that. And then that's going to result in some kind of an outcome. So this just allows us, if we take this formula, we have some better flexibility in how we can assess that risk and what the impact might be to us. And ultimately, when we start talking about the quantification, is really what are we trying to get to, right? And that is, we want to translate risk into dollars and cents as much as we can, because those that are holding the decisions and holding the purse strings, right, signing authority on the checkbook, are often leaders and thinkers that are oriented around dollars and cents, right? Understanding what is this going to cost me if I do it? What is this going to cost me if I don't do it? And so that's really kind of what we're driving to today. And so I want to give an introduction of kind of what this is, but then we're also going to highlight one sort of case study example of how this has been done before so that you can kind of see how this might work in practice. So what is risk quantification and how do we do it? This is this is the what, right? These are the steps. So I kind of had alluded to this on the slide prior, but right, we have a threat, and that might be a nation state, that could be a script kiddie, right? They will need to execute some sort of a method, right? And that might be exploiting a missing patch on one or more assets, and then that's going to have some level of impact in our organization. One of the advantages of FAIR is it's just like any other framework. Like if you've oriented your OT program around this CSF, you know that there isn't a pass-fail with that framework, right? We can set varying levels of maturity based on what makes sense for our organization, right? Where's our risk appetite? Where do we want to go? What industry are we in? And so FAIR also has some flexibility in how you define these variables. So an asset could be an individual device, right? This could be specific systems, an HMI or a PLC. You could roll asset up and define that as a production line or a subset or a process within a site or within a facility. Or we could go up another level and say that an asset is an entire manufacturing site, or this is an entire plant or refinery. And so we have the flexibility, but I also want to reiterate that there is an importance here that we need to stay consistent, right? So one of the, and we'll talk about this in a bit, one of the advantages of FAIR is it does allow you to compare impacts and quantify cyber risk across sites for comparison purposes. But we need to make sure we're comparing apples to apples, right? And so as we tweak this formula and we define what the attack method is, we don't want to compare, well, what is the cost of a supply chain attack on facility A compared to the cost of a exploited vulnerability or third-party compromise at facility B, right? Because we may not have as much value in that comparison. So how do we get to this point, right, of quantification? So we do need inputs, and this is a combination of information in our organization. These are our vulnerabilities that we've identified or enumerated. These are our controls or mitigating circumstances that we may have in place. This is industry-specific data, right? This is information about prior breaches. This is threat intelligence that we may have available to us, all kind of as inputs into this model to help drive the risk computation. Now, the risk computation step is typically done using Monte Carlo simulations. I don't know how familiar you are with that. I won't spend a lot of time, but it allows us to work in ranges. And so if you think about, as an example, if you think about your commute to your office, right? Your distance between your home and your office is a fixed distance, right? Let's say it's 25 miles. But that doesn't mean that our commute time is going to be fixed, right? Because there's a lot of variables like weather, if there's been an accident on the roadways, if it's a school day versus it's during the summer and school's not in session, right? And there's a school zone on our route. There's a lot of things that can impact our commute time. So we can run Monte Carlo simulations to look at, over the course of 100 days, what does my commute look like in terms of minutes? And it can kind of show you what's the best case scenario. It can show you the worst case scenario, and then something kind of in that median range is where you're going to see a lot of those simulations end up. And so if you ever go to Google Maps and you're like planning a road trip or looking at a route, you can set a future date and time to say, hey, well, how long is it going to take me to get from point A to point B tomorrow at 5 p.m.? And it will give you this range that says, well, this takes between 30 minutes and an hour. And so I don't know exactly if Monte Carlo is what they use, or that's their model, but the premise is the same, right? Where it's kind of giving you, here's what it looks like on the best day, here's what it looks like on the worst day. The reality is you can probably average that and come up with something in the middle. The other thing I'm going to highlight here and probably reiterate a few times is that we don't need every possible input in order to be able to run this model, in order to be able to quantify risk. Now, our ranges are going to be tighter and more accurate if we have more input data, but we can use what we have to be able to get an approximation, right? If today we have no idea what an outage of production line A at site 1 is going to cost us, then if we can get some level of an average approximation, we're already in a better spot today, right? Or tomorrow, right, than we are today if we're able to run that. So when we start talking about the outputs, then you start getting to a point where you can quantify this financially and help drive decision making, right? That's the ultimate goal here. Is we know that we live in a world of finite time and resources. We can't fix everything, we can't address everything, so we have to prioritize, and this is a tool that can help you do that, especially if you are maybe struggling with kind of where do we start, or we have a lot of things going on at once, but how do we know we're tackling the things that are helping reduce the most risk in our organization today? I've got 3 slides here, and these are I won't spend a lot of time on this. These are more of a, I would say, like a leave behind. We just kind of walk through the what is risk quantification. What do we do? This is really the how, and this isn't anything probably that you're not familiar with. If you think about any sort of process, end to end, right? We've got to discover assets. We've got to map out what are we going to analyze. We're going to define assets, identify the threats and enumerate those, the threats and vulnerabilities. Then we're going to gather as much industry-specific data and internal data about our organization as we can. We're going to run that through the simulations, and then we're going to get to a point where we can report some ranges of results here to help drive the decision making. So this is just a bit of, I would say, like a table of contents, right, of what we're about to walk through with a real-world case study, but wanted to leave this here. And then I've got some content around just at a high level what each of these steps would entail. So as we move forward to the specific case study that I wanted to highlight today, this was an automotive part manufacturer, and they were looking to answer a very similar question about, well, where do we have the most exposure, right? How do we know what we need to be spending our money on, right, in order to offset cybersecurity risk? So they picked 2 manufacturing sites across the globe. They were in different geographies. They made different types of products. So it was an intentional sample to kind of get to this number. But again, flexible framework. This can be done on 1 site. It can be done on 50 sites. So we have the ability to scale that. But in this particular example, it was two sites that they had selected. And then really, what did they want to get out of it? They wanted to understand where they had the most risk, right? So you may be in a spot where you've already got a good risk register or a good handle on where the specific OT threats or vulnerabilities are, which is great. You can probably shortcut that and start getting to, well, let's gather financial and accounting data and industry data and start to run calculations. You may be in a spot where you still need to kind of go and identify those things. And that's where this particular organization was. So really the first step is we visited both of these facilities and spent about a week on site, not only just walking the floor and understanding the technology and their key manufacturing processes, but we also met with folks like their plant finance and plant accounting because we needed some financial information to help as inputs into that quantification. So that was an important step here is we did need to go out and figure out, do we have appropriate segmentation, right? Are they allowing just anybody to plug in a USB in any USB device, right? Do we have internet access from the HMIs or the operator workstations on the floor, which they did. Many of them did. So those were the kind of things that we were looking for. Then we take, and as also as part of that, we're looking for any good practices that we see, right? If we do see that there are certain critical systems or unsupported systems like a Windows XP that is isolated, or certain key production lines that are isolated, then those are inputs that we want to use into determining what our risk is, right, in terms of dollars. So as we model the OT risk, that's when you're taking the controls and the good practices, you're taking the risks that you've identified, and then you're taking the other inputs that you gather, and then running that through the simulations to get to sort of where's the highest exposure, and then shaping recommendations for, okay, well, these are sort of the top 3 or top 5 areas where we had the highest dollar value exposure. We didn't just hand over a report at that point to leadership to say, well, okay, well, here it is, right? We need to go fix it. As OT practitioners, our role is often, whether you're in the advisory and consulting space or you are an operator and you're responsible or accountable for OT security in your organization, there's going to need to be some level of a roadmap or a game plan, right? What are the tactical steps we're going to take in order to reduce this risk and offset those vulnerabilities? So we want to start with OT threats and common threat scenarios. You're probably familiar with everything here. We're not reinventing the wheel, and not necessarily and not saying that this is a comprehensive list of every particular OT threat scenario or OT theme. and not to say that what we've highlighted here in the box around supply chain attacks is the most important or the most critical, but it is important to call out that we just, for illustrative purposes, wanted to zoom in on one of these to illustrate how the process works. So you could do what I'm about to walk through, you can do that on any combination of these or all of these if they are relevant in your organization and in your environment. So if we zoom in on supply chain attacks, think of this as kind of the SolarWinds scenario or example, right? You've got an actor that compromises the supplier source code, right? You have selected that, your organization has selected that supplier or that vendor, you've got them in your environment. You push the software updates, firmware updates or software updates to your devices, and then you've got some level of compromise in your environment that may also spread to other systems and impact some of your core functions, right? So this is what we call the threat chain. And again, if you go back to the previous slide, if we had selected malware and ransomware as you know, we'd have to build the same chain, right? Somebody's got a USB, somebody plugs in USB, it's infected by malware, it spreads to other systems. So we build out a similar threat chain. And the reason we do the mapping and we kind of build out these steps is because we want to be able to map these to source data, right? So we want to map out the steps, like if this attack would happen, what are the key, what does the key sequence of events look like? And then how do we now map this to our environment and how this impacts us? So the top two around industry data, this is where you can look at cost of data breach report, right? You can look at the Veris community database for the sort of a history of breaches, and anybody that has reported something like response costs, that can be included here. So you can look at historical data around this, these events happening. There are always going to be outliers like anything, but you should be able to get a decent approximation of how this happens, right, and how often and what the impacts are. You can look at the third-party risk management controls within your environment. Do we have a robust process to where we assess vendors? We obtain reports from them, whether that's SOC 2 or it's an ISO 27001-2 certification. But what due diligence do we do around this, and what monitoring do we do around the controls of that supplier before we introduce them into our environment? We allow new software, or we allow new hardware in the OT environment, because that also, this is sort of on the positive side of the equation, that's an input we want to use that's going to impact our annual loss expectancy or our cost in a positive manner, because this is the control, if we have that in place. And then the scanning and the on-site controls, these will be through any tools you have available, like if you have an OT asset discovery, vulnerability detection, threat detection tool in your environment, you can use the output from that, use the output from any site walkdowns you've done to sort of observe cyber-related risks on the floor, observe the presence of this third-party software, like how many devices is it impacting and how is it used. That can play into the scenario. And then lastly, getting with your finance or accounting teams and understanding what is the overall cost here. How is this going to impact us in terms of if we have a loss of, we have an outage, right? We have a stoppage in production. What are the costs associated with that? And we sort of can put all of this into the hopper together. One of the things that I have learned doing this, and we've learned as a firm, not only in OT, but doing this in other industries, is you do always have more data than you think you have. Now, that information may not be packaged up in a pretty Power BI dashboard. Like, we may have to do some Excel wizardry to get to that level of detail that we'd like to have to input into our model. But between information that's publicly available about prior breaches, about response costs that are associated with those, around any fines or penalties associated with those breaches, we take that plus the information we have around plant finance teams. If you're in manufacturing, they should have the data around, what is the revenue around, what does line A give us a year, right? What contractual obligations do we have tied to the product that we produce? in this facility or on this particular line. And so, again, I'm zooming in on one of these boxes here on this slide. These are all of the potential data sources you would want to get information on to run through the quantification model. But we want to take source data that we have, again, from our existing tool stack, any publicly available data around incidents and breaches. And then, again, if we're working with our finance or accounting teams, we're looking to understand, what's the cost of goods sold by the product line, right? What's our profit margin? We should have historical outage data. If we've had a P1 or a SEV1 outage for a day or for a week, if that has ever happened to us, then we should be able to lean back on that and say, well, then what did we determine the cost was to us? And we can use that, again, to get an approximation here. So the other thing is, as we look at the outputs here, this is where we run the simulations and we get our range. So we've got a couple of visuals here where you see some of the dollars and cents, and again, best case scenario, worst case scenario, and sort of what that middle median range looks like. And this is zooming in on the response costs specifically. So this would be, again, this is more of the publicly available data unless we have had an incident in the past. And this is something that we can lean back on and say, well, 2 years ago, we had to engage forensics or retainer services, and we've got some data we can use here. So you may be able to pull on that. If not, there's a lot that is publicly available. And some of the other things here that I'll highlight, like productivity costs, this would be, if you have a stoppage, what you may have to pay in labor for a stoppage in production. Fines and judgments, that could be compliance related if you're in a regulated industry. If you're not, then that could be violation of SLAs or contracts. So in this particular example, this client, as an auto part manufacturer, they make, let's call them widgets, right, for many of the big auto manufacturers, right? So they've got contracts with Tesla, they've got contracts with General Motors. And so in those agreements, there are penalties for downtime, right? If we're not able to provide X number of units each day or each month, whatever that quota is, we're not meeting that, then there's some level of fine or penalty that we're paying. And then that feeds kind of into reputational costs, right? Could we lose that relationship over this outage, right, or over this stoppage? That's something, that's probably maybe the stickiest thing here about how do we really quantify reputation costs. But as best as we can, again, even if we can get an approximation or leverage some historical data, we can feed that into the model to sort of come up with this range. And again, this is heavy manufacturing, but if you're in oil and gas, for example, number of barrels per day times price is probably what you're going to use as a starting point. Like if you're in drilling upstream oil and gas to understand what your impact is per day on a particular site. If we're talking about a collection of sites, then you can kind of multiply that and do the math. And so that would be kind of one of the sources of data if you're in something like oil and gas versus manufacturing. The other thing I'll highlight here is as we look at the cost comparisons here, in this particular example, we found that supply chain risk was the highest risk for them in terms of, once we quantified that. And a lot of that was driven by contractual obligations, right? And the vulnerabilities impacting those lines. So there were a couple of critical components that this company was manufacturing, and in some cases they had redundancy where they've got multiple lines that are making the same product, right? So if one line goes down, we've got the ability, maybe our capacity gets diminished a little bit, but we still have the ability to produce. We did find a couple of, I would call single points of failure, where, okay, there's only one line that makes this product, and this product is really important to General Motors, and this particular machine is run by a Windows 2000 box, and we also didn't build this. It was built by a vendor, and the vendor doesn't exist anymore, right? So we don't, and we used to have a spare, but there was a power blip and it fried the spare, or fried the main unit, and now we're running a spare. And so as you start to think about the likelihood of an outage, right, and if you're looking at your simulations, those are all of those inputs, right? We have a single point of failure, we don't have redundant capacity, then that drives up these numbers around supply chain risk. And we also zoomed in here you can look at, for the entire manufacturing site, all product lines, what we approximated as the current risk cost, but you can also drill into specific lines. So if you go to manufacturing site 1 here, on line 1, that's a $1.1 million annual loss expectancy for that line if it goes down. And so that's kind of as you look at the criticality of these lines or these locations, again, what we're trying to drive to is, where do we need to start and where do we have the most exposure today? Conversely, you can look at, where do we have good controls or measures in place that are reducing that number, right? So network outage in your organization, that might be, if you run something like this, that may show up as one of your highest exposure costs. In this particular case, they had good redundancy around their networking. They have redundancy between facilities. So if there's a line that goes down in facility A, there's a neighboring facility B that they can pick up and make that same product, and we can still kind of meet our quotas. They also had some cases where they had a lot of stuff that didn't depend on the broader LAN network, right, or WAN network. So they might have a reduced capacity, or it may be a little bit more efficient because they have to pull some reports manually. But again, if we don't have a network, PLCs are going to continue to run what they've been programmed to do. And so kind of in this case, we found that wasn't really sort of a network outage, and something like that, or even denial of service, wasn't the biggest exposure for them. So you may surprise yourself, right? You may have an idea of how these numbers are going to fall, but every time we go through one of these, we find some kind of surprises and maybe some things that we didn't expect that pop up a little bit higher on the list. And so as we wrap here, again, a very, very high-level overview. We didn't have the time to get into a lot of the nitty-gritty about how this works, but again, just wanted to give an introduction about how this is possible, and to suggest this as an option, right, to consider. And I also want to highlight that this is, I hope you take away from this that this is accessible. I wouldn't want there to be an impression that this is something that's super academic and that this is not industry specific to something like manufacturing or to oil and gas. Traditionally, banking and insurance and more heavily regulated industries, because their maturity is a little bit higher in the cybersecurity space, again, generally speaking, they have spent more time on risk quantification. But there's a lot of flexibility here. You don't have to have all of the data. You don't have to have all of the inputs in order to be able to work within ranges in the simulations and start to get an approximation of where you have the highest exposure. And over time, as you mature, as you get better at identifying risks, as you implement more compensating measures and controls, you have the ability to kind of rerun that and see how the numbers change and and then you can directly then tie your investment to offset of risk and those dollars, and present that in a language that executives can understand and appreciate. So as we kind of close here, there's just a couple of things that, what do we really, within this particular case study, what did the organization feel like they could speak to, or what did they feel like was the benefit of this engagement? They felt like they better understood what the risks were. They felt they could better prioritize where the remedial efforts needed to go, and they could really use return on investment to drive their decision making, knowing that where they could offset the most risk and how they could track the ROI of those investment dollars. So just a high level overview there. Appreciate everybody tuning in today, and with that I will wrap, and I think we've got just to see if there's any questions. I'll turn over to AJ.
Yeah, may we kindly request you to be here at the mic. Thank you.
Hey, Justin, Mick Bronze from Southern Company. On the risk scenarios, how much How much focus do you put on non-cyber risks? Because I could see going to the business and saying, hey, we think these are the biggest cyber things, but the business may be thinking about something different entirely, like the need to upgrade multiple pumps in a manufacturing facility or something like that that has a bigger business impact.
Yeah, that's a great question. Again, it's a cyber-focused framework, but there's the flexibility to bake that in, right? So you may have something like environmental factors and variables that may cause an outage, that may drive that number, and you may want to use that framework for that. That's a great, in my opinion, a great use case for that. I will point out that in this particular client scenario, they were pretty adamant that they wanted to keep it very cyber-focused, and something like, we've only got one power feed coming into this plant, right? And we have there's a hurricane or some natural disaster and we lose power, that could cause an outage, right? They acknowledge that, but they kind of agree to scope it out of this particular analysis. But great question, and in my opinion, a great use case for that, and it is a way that you could deploy the framework. Yeah, great question. Thank you.